Imagine walking into a house so silent, so still, it feels like the air itself is holding its breath. A house that looks perfectly normal from the outside, neatly trimmed lawn, toys scattered across the front porch, wind chimes softly swaying, but what's hidden behind that front door is nothing short of a living nightmare. Detectives who've seen it all, homicides, domestic disputes, missing persons, were brought to their knees by what they discovered inside. They thought they were prepared for anything, but nothing could prepare them for this. In the next few minutes, we're diving into the most gruesome, psychologically disturbing, and hauntingly unforgettable cases ever handled by law enforcement. These aren't just crimes, they're twisted puzzles, the kind that claw their way into your mind and linger long after the case is closed. If you've ever wondered how far darkness can reach into the human soul, you're about to find out. And yes, by the end of this video, you'll get the answer to the very question that brought you here. Hey you. Yeah, you watching right now. I know what you're thinking. Another crime story, right? Maybe you've seen dozens like it. But trust me when I say, this one is different. This is the story that shook veteran detectives to their core. A story so intense, even seasoned officers couldn't sleep for weeks. What you're about to hear will challenge your understanding of evil and make you question everything you thought you knew about the human mind. I want you to stay with me through this entire journey, not just because there's a shocking twist at the end, and believe me, there is, but because this case reveals something much deeper. It peels back the mask society wears and shows us what lurks underneath. This isn't just about murder. This is about the darkest recesses of human psychology, the kind of depravity that's usually reserved for horror movies. But this is real. It happened. And the people involved are still living with the scars. Let's talk about the people at the heart of the story. Not the killer, not yet, but the detectives. These men and women are trained to think rationally, to follow procedure, to separate emotion from evidence. They know that horror is part of the job. But nothing could have prepared them for what they encountered in a quiet Midwestern town, where the scent of death had clung to the air for days before a neighbor dared to report anything. The lead detective, a man with 25 years of experience in violent crimes, later admitted he nearly walked away from the force after this case. "It changed me," he said. "I thought I'd seen it all. I hadn't. That's how bad it was. That's how disturbing. And that's why we're here." As the investigation unfolded, the team realized this wasn't a simple homicide. No, what they found was a carefully constructed theater of horror, one where the victims had been turned into unwilling actors in a play that only the killer understood. The living room had been staged like a twisted family dinner, complete with mannequins dressed in real clothes, dinner plates arranged with precision, and a tape recorder looping sounds of laughter and casual conversation. Except there were no guests. Just the bodies, motionless, positioned like they were mid-meal, their eyes wide open, staring into nothing. This wasn't just crime. This was performance. This was madness with a method. And this was only the beginning. You're probably feeling a mix of curiosity and unease right now. That's normal. That means you're human. We're drawn to the unexplained, the unsettling, because deep down we want to understand how something like this could happen. How someone could become so detached from reality, so utterly consumed by darkness, that they'd turn murder into art. And that's exactly what the detectives asked themselves, too. How do you catch someone who doesn't kill for rage, revenge, or money, but for meaning? Someone who believes they're telling a story with every life they take. And more importantly, how do you stop them before they write their final chapter? Let me pause here for a moment and ask you something. Have you ever looked at someone you know, maybe a neighbor, a coworker, someone you pass on your morning walk, and wondered what they're hiding? We all wear masks. We all carry secrets. But some people? They carry monsters. This case is a reminder that evil doesn't always come with warning signs. Sometimes, it hides in plain sight. Behind a smile, behind a handshake, behind the door of a house that looks just like yours. If that thought sends a chill down your spine, you're not alone. You're starting to see what the detectives saw. You're starting to feel what they felt. The deeper they dug, the stranger the clues became. Cryptic messages left on mirrors, children's toys arranged in morbid patterns, Fingerprints wiped clean, but blood splatter deliberately left in place, as if the killer wanted to be caught, but only after the detectives solved their riddle. There was a pattern here, a story unfolding in grotesque chapters, and every piece of evidence was a line of dialogue from a killer's script. It wasn't just about what happened, it was about why. And when they finally began to piece together the motivation, what they uncovered was a backstory soaked in trauma, obsession, and psychological decay. But here's where things get even darker, and this is the part that made the seasoned detectives' hands tremble as they wrote their reports. The killer didn't act alone. There were others, willing participants, people who helped plan, helped cover, and in some cases watched. People who lived normal lives by day and turned into accomplices by night. And the worst part? One of them was someone no one suspected. Someone close. Someone trusted. Someone the detectives had spoken to early in the investigation. And let go. That mistake would haunt them. Now, I know you're hooked. I can feel it. And you should be, because this story is more than a mystery. It's a warning. A wake-up call. A look into how human minds can bend, break, and become something truly terrifying. We've just scratched the surface of what happened in that house, and what it took to bring the truth into the light. You're going to hear the confessions. You're going to see how the pieces came together. And you're going to walk step by step with the investigators as they uncover layer after horrifying layer. But not yet, because before we get to the moment everything breaks wide open, there's one more secret the detectives haven't shared. A secret buried, not in evidence, but in silence. Something they found that was so disturbing, so grotesque, they debated whether to make it public at all. Something that changed the direction of the entire investigation and led them to a second crime scene, one even more horrifying than the first. And that is where our story really begins. Over the course of several interviews, friends and neighbors painted a confusing portrait of Daniel. Some described him as withdrawn in recent weeks, quieter, distracted, even paranoid. Others noticed an uptick in his religious intensity, mentioning that he had started attending late-night prayer meetings and speaking about visions and cleansing. He stopped showing up for soccer practice without explanation, canceled several clients at the last minute, and was seen pacing his backyard for hours at night, whispering to himself, eyes locked on the stars. To those who knew him best, it felt like something was building inside him, some internal pressure no one could see, but everyone could feel. As investigators dug deeper into Daniel's recent activities, they discovered a trail of strange behavior and troubling associations. Bank records showed several large, unexplained withdrawals. Surveillance footage from a local hardware store captured him purchasing chains, plastic sheeting, and industrial-strength cleaning agents, all items that, taken individually, wouldn't raise eyebrows. But in the context of a murder investigation, they screamed premeditation. Then came the discovery of encrypted emails sent from an alias account to an online group known for fringe conspiracy theories and radical beliefs. The content was cryptic, filled with religious references, philosophical ramblings, and what seemed like coded messages. It became clear to detectives that Daniel wasn't just spiraling, he was preparing. But preparing for what? That question loomed large, casting doubt on every detail they uncovered. What made the case even more perplexing was that Daniel had no criminal record, no history of violence or abuse, not even a parking ticket, and yet his name kept coming up. His fingerprints were found in the house. A single strand of hair matching his DNA was located on one of the victims. But the evidence didn't fully align. Neighbors claimed they saw Daniel out of town the weekend the murders took place, visiting a cousin 2 hours away. The cousin confirmed it. Gas station receipts and dashcam footage seemed to support his alibi. So how could he be in two places at once? Was someone trying to frame him? Or was Daniel involved in ways no one could yet understand? That's when detectives turned their attention to Daniel's inner circle, hoping to piece together the relationships that may have influenced or misled him. His ex-girlfriend, Melanie Hughes, was the first person they questioned. The breakup had been messy, but not violent. Still, there were lingering resentments. Melanie hinted that Daniel had been emotionally unstable toward the end of their relationship, obsessed with dark dreams and haunted by what he called unfinished cycles. She believed he was unraveling but said nothing to the police because, as she put it, he never hurt anyone. He just scared himself. Her testimony added a layer of psychological depth to Daniel's profile, suggesting a man fighting demons not even he could fully comprehend. But when asked where she was during the time frame of the crime, Melanie hesitated. She claimed she had been out of town, visiting a friend in another state, but couldn't provide proof. Her phone was turned off for an entire weekend, her credit cards unused. Suddenly, Daniel wasn't the only one under scrutiny. Complicating matters even further was the appearance of another name, Caleb Monroe, a former employee at Daniel's landscaping company. Caleb had been fired 6 months prior for stealing tools, but according to several sources, he blamed Daniel for ruining his life. He had a short fuse, a criminal past, and a penchant for violent outbursts. A background check revealed multiple arrests for assault and drug possession. When detectives brought him in for questioning, Caleb denied any involvement, but his reaction was erratic. He kept asking if they found the tapes and muttering about cleansing rituals and voices in the walls. His fingerprints weren't found at the crime scene, but a set of muddy work boots in his home matched prints found near the back entrance of the house. Was this the break detectives needed, or another misdirection in a case that was quickly becoming a labyrinth? As the pieces slowly came together, another disturbing detail surfaced, one that cast doubt on everything the detectives thought they understood. A former tenant of the crime scene house, a woman named Lorna Pierce, came forward after seeing the case on the news. She claimed to have experienced dark energy in the house years before and reported waking up several times to strange chanting coming from the basement. She said she moved out after only 3 months, convinced that something evil lingered there. Detectives initially dismissed her as another sensationalist drawn to tragedy. But when they reviewed the old tenant records, her name checked out. And tucked away in the property manager's files was a forgotten complaint from the early 2000s about foul odors, unexplained noises, and symbols scratched into the walls. Suddenly, the house itself became a character in the story, a possible vessel for something older, something deeper. Was the horror rooted in the people who entered, or in the place itself? And then there were the drawings.
Hundreds of them.
Hidden in a storage unit Daniel rented under a different name. They were disturbing, surreal, and methodical. Each drawing depicted a faceless family seated at a dinner table, with black figures looming in the corners, figures with sharp, unnatural limbs and hollow eyes. In some, the faces were blurred. In others, they were twisted into silent screams. The recurring themes were undeniable. It wasn't art, it was obsession. Worse, some of the drawn faces resembled the victims. But how could he have known them? There was no official connection. No phone records, no shared social media, not even overlapping friend groups. The randomness of it all made it even more terrifying. And just when detectives thought they had a handle on the chaos, a final twist emerged. An anonymous tipster called the station, their voice distorted, giving nothing but coordinates. At first, they thought it was a prank, until they followed the lead and found a second location deep in the woods. What they discovered there would not only challenge everything they knew about the case, it would threaten to unravel their grip on reality itself. The truth was no longer just hidden. It was buried. And the deeper they dug, the darker it got. Just as Detective Lane was reeling from the intrusion into her private files, a new thread emerged, one that no one on the task force saw coming. It started when an old friend of Daniel Whitmore's, a man named Eli Travers, contacted authorities after watching the local news coverage. Eli hadn't spoken to Daniel in over a year, not since a falling out over a business loan that went sour, but something about the reports rattled him. Eli claimed he had recently received a strange envelope in his mailbox. No return address, no markings, just his name typed neatly on the front. Inside was a single Polaroid photograph of a house engulfed in flames. On the back, the message read, "The fire always comes before the silence." At first, Eli thought it was some kind of prank. But after learning about the murders and the fire-damaged room discovered at Daniel's house, one that appeared to have been torched from the inside, he knew it was connected. What terrified him even more was that the house in the photo wasn't Daniel's. It was his childhood home, a home that had burned to the ground 25 years ago in what was ruled an accidental electrical fire. A fire that had killed his younger sister. That revelation cracked open another layer of the mystery, one rooted in past trauma and buried connections. Lane immediately pulled archived fire reports and police records, and what she found shifted the entire investigation. The 1999 fire at Eli's childhood home had strange similarities to the current case: symbols found in the ashes, missing pages from the fire inspector's logs, and conflicting eyewitness statements. Even stranger, a name appeared in the fire report as a curious onlooker who had arrived on the scene before emergency services. That name? Richard Ames. The same former captain who now claimed to have no knowledge of Daniel's involvement or the crime scene house. Suddenly, Lane wasn't looking at an isolated incident or a deranged individual. She was staring down the possibility of a decades-long chain of events involving multiple locations, recurring symbols, and the same shadowy figures reappearing in places they should never have been. But just as this new lead gained traction, another shockwave hit. One of the crime scene analysts, Darren Klein, a tech-savvy investigator who'd been combing through the CCTV footage near the scene, was found unconscious in his home, an apparent victim of an overdose. The official report called it accidental. But Lane had seen Darren just 2 days prior, energized and on the verge of a breakthrough. He'd claimed to have recovered altered footage from a traffic cam 2 blocks from the crime scene. According to him, a figure in a black hoodie had been caught walking away from the house moments after the estimated time of death, carrying what looked like a rolled-up tarp. He told Lane he'd decrypted and enhanced the image enough to make out a partial face. But when she tried to retrieve the file from his work server, it was gone, erased, not just deleted. Not a trace left behind. Whoever was behind this had access to more than just public records. They were watching from the inside, always ready to erase whatever truth crept too close to the surface. Lane began to suspect that Darren's overdose wasn't an accident. The message had been delivered before: stop digging or pay the price. But the deeper she sank into the chaos, the harder it became to trust anyone. Even within the task force, things felt off. Detectives who once worked shoulder to shoulder were now withholding information, sidestepping questions, and pushing for the case to be handed over to federal agencies. It sounded logical, standard practice when a case spanned multiple states and decades. But to Lane, it felt more like a coordinated effort to shut her down. And then came the most troubling discovery yet. One of the officers leading the federal handoff, Agent Veronica Sloan, had briefly attended the same fringe religious school Daniel was obsessed with in his final months. It had been wiped from her professional history, but Lane found a buried news article linking her to the institution after a minor controversy involving former students. When confronted, Sloan brushed it off as a coincidence and warned Lane not to confuse paranoia with police work. But the look in her eyes said more than her words ever could. Lane wasn't paranoid. She was on the verge of seeing something that others were desperate to keep hidden. And then came the contradiction that shattered what little certainty remained. A forensic report arrived that undermined a major foundation of the case. The strand of hair believed to link Daniel to the victims? It wasn't a match. Not even close. Somehow, the lab had misidentified the sample. Whether through incompetence or deliberate tampering, no one could say. This bombshell forced investigators to reconsider everything. Had Daniel really been there? Was he truly the orchestrator of the horror, or a scapegoat positioned perfectly to take the fall? And if not him, then who had manipulated the scene, planted the disturbing artwork, and left the fingerprints that didn't belong to any known suspect? The team was in disarray. Lane found herself increasingly isolated, locked in a game of psychological warfare where each clue only led to more questions, more suspects, more lies. Eli Travers, who had initially come forward with the photo, now refused to cooperate. He claimed he was being followed, his phone tapped, his home broken into. He had started sleeping in his car, refusing to stay in one place for more than a night. Lane wanted to believe he was just scared, but part of her began to wonder if Eli knew more than he was letting on. Maybe the message wasn't just a warning to him. Maybe it was a reminder of something he'd tried for years to forget. And just as Lane was about to confront him, Just as she pulled into the shadowy parking lot of an abandoned diner where Eli had agreed to meet her, her phone rang. It was a blocked number. She answered, expecting another warning, another distorted threat. But what she heard chilled her to her core. A child's voice whispered, "We're not done yet." And then the line went dead. The cold whisper of the child's voice stayed with Detective Marissa Lane long after the call ended. It wasn't just eerie, it was calculated. That voice didn't belong to any real child. She was sure of it. It had a rehearsed quality, the kind of tone used to trigger fear on purpose. The kind of details someone plans when they want to rattle you from the inside out. And it worked. She sat frozen in her car outside the crumbling diner, heart pounding in her throat, eyes scanning the surrounding darkness for any movement. But the lot was empty. Eli never showed. She waited 30 minutes, maybe longer, watching shadows stretch and warp under the flickering streetlight, and when she finally left, she couldn't shake the overwhelming feeling that she was being watched. It wasn't just fear anymore, it was dread. The kind that seeps into your bones and makes every step feel heavier. Over the next few days, Lane noticed the signs piling up. Her apartment felt off. Not violated exactly, but unfamiliar. Drawers slightly ajar. Picture frames angled differently. A half-drunk water bottle she didn't remember leaving out. She told herself she was imagining things, classic symptoms of burnout and stress. But then came the surveillance photo. It was waiting for her on her desk at the precinct one morning, mixed into a stack of routine case files. A single image, printed on cheap paper. It showed her asleep in her bed, face turned slightly to the side, captured through the partially closed blinds of her bedroom window. No timestamp, no message. Just proof that someone had been inside her world, inside her safety, without her ever knowing it. That was the moment she stopped pretending she had control. Her supervisor ordered her to take a week off. Mandatory rest, they called it, but Lane knew it was more of a warning. Her obsession with the case had become a liability. Too many hours logged, too many boundaries crossed, too many files pulled without authorization. The official stance was to slow down the investigation and let federal agents take the lead. But Lane couldn't do it. Not when she felt the answers were slipping further away each day. Not when every lead was vanishing into smoke. First, Eli Travers disappeared. His phone disconnected, his email deactivated, and when Lane visited the last address on file, she found the apartment cleared out. Not packed up, abandoned. Food still in the fridge, mail on the floor, the bathroom light buzzing softly like someone had just left minutes earlier. He was gone like he'd never existed. Paranoia gripped her tightly after that. Cars followed her longer than usual in traffic. A man in a hoodie appeared in the background of her grocery store security cam footage 3 days in a row, always hovering, never engaging. Her email was hacked, then restored without explanation. Even the therapist the department had assigned her, someone she'd started to confide in, began asking questions that felt more like intelligence gathering than care. Who have you told about the files? Have you shared your notes with anyone outside law enforcement? Have you considered that this obsession is becoming delusional? The tone was calm, professional, but layered with something else, skepticism, maybe even surveillance. Lane began recording their sessions on her own, just in case. She didn't know who she could trust anymore. Every instinct in her screamed that she was being boxed in. Not just by a killer, but by something bigger, an organized effort to suppress the truth. But the most terrifying realization came late one night as she pored over her handwritten notes, the only copies she hadn't digitized. She noticed something that hadn't been there before. A single sentence scribbled in red ink on the bottom of a page she hadn't touched in weeks. "You're chasing ghosts while the monster stands beside you." Her heart stopped. The ink was fresh. Her handwriting notebooks were always locked in a drawer, and only one person had access to her apartment with a key, a colleague she'd trusted for years, Detective Paul Reyes. A man who had comforted her through the worst parts of the case, who brought her coffee when she pulled all-nighters, who'd always known exactly when to step in. She'd never suspected him. Not once. But now? The timelines lined up too cleanly. He had access to the evidence room. He'd once worked under Richard Ames. He'd been the one who retrieved the surveillance footage that later went missing. And more importantly, he had been the last person to speak to Darren Klein before his so-called overdose. Lane didn't want to believe it. The idea that someone she knew, someone who had become like family, could be part of this web was almost too much to bear. But the whisper on the phone, the photo on her desk, the handwriting on her notes, it was all adding up to one terrifying truth. She was never just investigating a killer. She was dancing through a network of lies, and now she was the target. And the more she looked over her shoulder, the more she realized this wasn't just about solving a crime anymore. This was about surviving one. The cold whisper of the child's voice stayed with Detective Marissa Lane long after the call ended. It wasn't just eerie, it was calculated. That voice didn't belong to any real child. She was sure of it. It had a rehearsed quality, the kind of tone used to trigger fear on purpose. The kind of detail someone plans when they want to rattle you from the inside out. And it worked. She sat frozen in her car outside the crumbling diner, heart pounding in her throat, eyes scanning the surrounding darkness for any movement. But the lot was empty. Eli never showed. She waited 30 minutes, maybe longer, watching shadows stretch and warp under the flickering streetlight, and when she finally left, she couldn't shake the overwhelming feeling that she was being watched. It wasn't just fear anymore, it was dread. The kind that seeps into your bones and makes every step feel heavier. Over the next few days, Lane noticed the signs piling up. Her apartment felt off. Not violated exactly, but unfamiliar. Drawers slightly ajar. Picture frames angled differently. A half-drunk water bottle she didn't remember leaving out. She told herself she was imagining things, classic symptoms of burnout and stress. But then came the surveillance photo. It was waiting for her on her desk at the precinct one morning, mixed into a stack of routine case files. A single image, printed on cheap paper. It showed her asleep in her bed, face turned slightly to the side, captured through the partially closed blinds of her bedroom window. No timestamp, no message, just proof that someone had been inside her world, inside her safety, without her ever knowing it. That was the moment she stopped pretending she had control. Her supervisor ordered her to take a week off. Mandatory rest, they called it, but Lane knew it was more of a warning. Her obsession with the case had become a liability. Too many hours logged, too many boundaries crossed, too many files pulled without authorization. The official stance was to slow down the investigation and let federal agents take the lead. But Lane couldn't do it. Not when she felt the answers were slipping further away each day. Not when every lead was vanishing into smoke. First, Eli Travers disappeared. His phone disconnected, his email deactivated, and when Lane visited the last address on file, she found the apartment cleared out. Not packed up, abandoned. Food still in the fridge, mail on the floor, the bathroom light buzzing softly like someone had just left minutes earlier. He was gone like he'd never existed. And what disturbed her even more was what she found in his trash can, a burnt corner of the same Polaroid he'd been mailed, the words on the back still faintly legible beneath the ash. The fire always comes before the silence. Paranoia gripped her tightly after that. Cars followed her longer than usual in traffic. A man in a hoodie appeared in the background of her grocery store security cam footage 3 days in a row, always hovering, never engaging. Her email was hacked, then restored without explanation. Even the therapist the department had assigned her, someone she'd started to confide in, began asking questions that felt more like intelligence gathering than care. Who have you told about the files? Have you shared your notes with anyone outside law enforcement? Have you considered that this obsession is becoming delusional? The tone was calm, professional, but layered with something else, skepticism, maybe even surveillance. Lane began recording their sessions on her own, just in case. She didn't know who she could trust anymore. Every instinct in her screamed that she was being boxed in. Not just by a killer, but by something bigger, an organized effort to suppress the truth. But the most terrifying realization came late one night as she pored over her handwritten notes, the only copies she hadn't digitized. She noticed something that hadn't been there before. A single sentence scribbled in red ink on the bottom of a page she hadn't touched in weeks. You're chasing ghosts while the monster stands beside you. Her heart stopped. The ink was fresh. Her handwriting notebooks were always locked in a drawer, and only one person had access to her apartment with a key, a colleague she'd trusted for years, Detective Paul Reyes. A man who had comforted her through the worst parts of the case, who brought her coffee when she pulled all-nighters, who'd always known exactly when to step in. She'd never suspected him. Not once. But now? The timelines lined up too cleanly. He had access to the evidence room. He'd once worked under Richard Ames. He'd been the one who retrieved the surveillance footage that later went missing. And more importantly, he had been the last person to speak to Darren Klein before his so-called overdose. Lane didn't want to believe it. The idea that someone she knew, someone who had become like family, could be part of this web was almost too much to bear. But the whisper on the phone, the photo on her desk, the handwriting on her notes. Marissa Lane never imagined she'd one day be staring into the eyes of someone she once trusted more than family, heart pounding with disbelief and fury, knowing deep down that the person sitting across from her had been feeding her lies like poison for months. Confronting Paul Reyes wasn't a decision she made lightly. She knew the moment she stepped into that dimly lit corner of the precinct's empty garage, it could change everything. He stood near his car, casual, as if this were just another end to another long day. But she'd already rehearsed every word in her head, every question, every angle. What she hadn't prepared for was the way he looked at her when she showed him the footage, the faint twitch in his jaw, the narrowing of his eyes, the moment he realized the game was over. And yet, instead of denying it or begging for forgiveness, he simply leaned against the hood of his vehicle, folded his arms, and gave her a look that chilled her to her core. "You don't know what you've stepped into, Marissa," he said, voice low, barely above a whisper, like someone reciting a prayer too dangerous to speak aloud. "This isn't about Daniel, or those victims, or even the killings. You're chasing the wrong nightmare." And just like that, he made her question everything again. Because there was something behind those words, something that didn't feel like a threat, but a warning. A desperate, final plea not to dig any deeper. But it was already too late. Every fiber of her being screamed that the truth was close, so close it was almost tangible. Still, Paul didn't flinch. He pulled a small envelope from his coat pocket, handed it to her, and said, "This is the only lifeline you'll get. Walk away now, and they'll leave you alone. Keep going and you'll end up like Eli, like Klein, like I should have years ago." Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the dark before she could respond. Back in her apartment, Lane tore open the envelope with shaking hands. Inside was a key card, a burner phone, and a printed photo. The image was grainy, time-stamped for a day she was sure Paul had been out of town on a training retreat. It showed him standing in a storage unit filled with boxes and evidence bags, items Lane recognized as part of the missing materials from the original 1999 arson case, the case that had supposedly been closed with no suspects. She realized now that the case had never been closed. It had been buried. Intentionally. And Paul had been its undertaker. The burner phone pinged immediately, displaying a single message. "Meet me at the Red Pines Motel. Come alone. Midnight." Lane sat there for nearly an hour, staring at that message, her thoughts spiraling into chaos. She was exhausted, emotionally shredded, terrified, and completely alone. The system she believed in had rotted from the inside. Every ally was now a possible enemy. Every clue she uncovered only led to more manipulation, more buried secrets. And now she was faced with a choice that felt impossible. She could take the key card and disappear, leave town, protect herself, pretend she never saw that footage or discovered what she knew. Or she could keep pulling at the tangled threads and risk everything. Her badge. Her safety. Her life. She thought of Eli Travers, how broken he'd been, how he'd tried to warn her but never said the full truth. She thought of Daniel Whitmore, scribbling out his nightmares with no one to listen. She thought of the victims, their names, their faces, their unfinished stories, and realized she couldn't just walk away. No matter how many ghosts waited on the other side, she owed them the truth. Even if it killed her. She drove to the motel in silence, headlights cutting through the rain-slicked streets, heart thudding with every mile. The Red Pines Motel was a decaying relic from a forgotten time, nestled off a service road that hadn't seen real traffic in years. Room 6B. The door was slightly ajar. She stepped inside with her hand on her concealed weapon, nerves wired tight enough to snap. But what she found inside stopped her cold. A woman mid-50s, familiar in a way she couldn't place, stood in the center of the room, holding a manila folder that looked like it hadn't seen daylight in decades. "You don't remember me," the woman said softly. "But you should. My name is Ruth Carter. I'm Daniel's mother." Lane felt her world tilt. Daniel's mother was supposed to be dead. She'd read the death certificate herself, the overdose filed, the case closed. But this woman was very much alive. "They paid me to disappear," Ruth said, her voice trembling with equal parts regret and fear. "To let the world think I was gone, so no one would ask questions about what happened in that house. About what happened to those children." Marissa felt her throat tighten as a million questions crowded her mind. But before she could speak, Ruth handed her the folder. "Everything you need to understand is in here. But once you open it, there's no going back." And just as Lane reached out to take it, a single gunshot shattered the night. The window exploded inward, glass raining down like ice. Ruth fell to the ground with a soft gasp, the folder slipping from her grasp, its contents scattering across the motel floor. Lane dove for cover, heart racing, the sound of footsteps running outside confirming her worst fear. Someone had followed her. Someone knew she'd come here. She crawled to Ruth's side, blood already pooling beneath her. The woman's eyes met hers one last time. "He's not who you think he is," she whispered. "And you're not either." And with those words, the last remaining piece of Lane's identity crumbled under the weight of a truth she didn't yet understand. The moment Lane sprinted out of the motel into the cold rain, adrenaline pumping and heart hammering, she knew she wasn't just running for her life anymore. She was running straight into something she couldn't back out of. The distant sound of tires screeching off into the darkness confirmed it. Whoever had pulled that trigger hadn't come to intimidate. They'd come to silence. Ruth Carter was dead. The last living person who might have explained what happened in 1999, who could have connected all the threads between Daniel, Eli, and the others. Gone in a second. Lane shoved the blood-soaked folder into her jacket, barely glancing at the scattered pages, and sped away, terrified that every car she passed might be another trap. Back at her apartment, she locked every door, pulled the blinds tight, and laid out the documents on her kitchen table, hands trembling. What she found was worse than she expected. The folder wasn't just personal history, it was proof of a decades-long cover-up orchestrated by people with authority, power, and zero conscience. Photographs, handwritten letters, sealed mental health evaluations. Names of children pulled from the same foster system. Redacted incident reports tied to fire investigations, abuse allegations, and unexplained disappearances, all pointing back to a state-run youth facility that had been quietly shut down in the early 2000s after a budget audit. But tucked at the bottom of the stack, nearly torn in half and stained with age, was a black-and-white group photo. 6 children lined up outside a crumbling brick building, with a hand-scrawled note on the back. 3 survived. 2 went missing. 1 never left. Daniel was in the photo.
So was Eli.
And Lane. She dropped the picture, as if it burned her fingers. She had no memory of that place, no recollection of ever being in foster care. Her entire childhood, she'd been told, was spent with her grandparents after her parents died in a car crash. But suddenly that story felt thin, rehearsed, and deeply wrong. The dates didn't add up. The official record said she was adopted at 4, but the image showed a girl her age, her face, her eyes, standing next to Daniel, clearly older than that.
It was all a lie.
And the lie ran deeper than she could have ever imagined.
Her phone rang.
Unknown number. Against every instinct, she answered. You opened it. A voice said, low, male, familiar in a way that made her stomach flip. I told Reyes you wouldn't stop. Who is this? She demanded. You've been looking at this the wrong way. You think this ends with Daniel. You think he's the key. But he's not the architect. He's the survivor. We all are. The ones that are left. Lane's mind reeled. She wanted to scream, to beg for clarity, but the man kept talking. You're part of this whether you want to be or not. They didn't just erase your past. They rewrote it. Because you saw something when you were a child, something they couldn't risk getting out. That fire in '99? That wasn't the first one. It was the last in a chain. You just didn't remember. Until now. The line went dead. Lane staggered backward, heart racing so hard she thought it might split her ribs. She looked back at the documents, the photo, the letters, and then it hit her like a cold wave. That's why Paul Reyes had watched her so closely over the years, why he inserted himself into her life, her training, her career. He wasn't just a mentor.
He'd been assigned.
Planted. His job wasn't to guide her, it was to keep her blind. And suddenly the floodgates opened. The odd gaps in her memory. The recurring nightmares of fire, screams, and faces she couldn't place. The way she always felt on edge near certain cases involving arson or abuse. Her instincts weren't paranoia. They were echoes. Ghosts of something she'd lived through but had been forced to forget. Now everything made sense and none of it did. There was no question anymore that the conspiracy stretched far beyond one killer or one case. There were others like her, survivors erased and repackaged with new identities. Victims of a program that never should have existed. The fires were cover stories. The dead were loose ends. And the survivors? They were time bombs, waiting to remember. Lane didn't sleep that night.
She didn't eat.
She couldn't. Every breath was a battle to keep from unraveling. The only thing she could do was act. She began scanning the files, photographing every page, uploading everything to multiple encrypted drives. She sent one to a reporter she barely trusted, another to a retired judge who owed her a favor, and she kept the last for herself. If they were going to silence her next, they'd have to work for it. But as dawn began to crawl across the horizon, another message came through. No name, no number, just a single video attachment. She hit play, her stomach in knots. It was a live feed. Paul Reyes, tied to a chair, bleeding, struggling to breathe. Then a distorted voice filled the speakers. You should have walked away, Marissa. Now it's his life for the truth. Make your choice. And the screen went black. As the investigation pressed on, and the puzzle began forming a shape, detectives found themselves haunted by more than just the horrors of the crime. They were now battling forces that seemed determined to keep the truth buried. Just when momentum began to build, a crucial piece of evidence vanished without explanation. The encrypted hard drive recovered from Daniel's storage unit, believed to contain the original digital sketches and messages exchanged with the shadowy online group, was gone. One moment, it was logged into the evidence room, and the next, it simply disappeared. No sign of forced entry. No surveillance footage of tampering. Just a blank space where the key to the killer's psyche had once been. Internal Affairs launched an investigation into the disappearance, but nothing came of it. Someone on the inside was playing a dangerous game, and that realization made the detectives question everything and everyone around them. It was around this time that Detective Marissa Lane, one of the youngest but sharpest minds on the case, received a note on her windshield. No envelope, no signature. Just one sentence written in thick black ink. Stop digging or you'll end up like them. It wasn't the first anonymous threat she'd received since taking on violent crime cases, but this one hit differently. It was too specific. Too personal. Whoever left it knew where she lived, what she drove, and how close she was to unlocking something bigger than a standard murder case. That note marked a turning point. From then on, the tension around the task force was palpable. Colleagues whispered when they thought no one was listening. Phones seemed tapped. Files went missing. And despite all of it, Lane couldn't shake the feeling that someone within their own circle didn't want the truth coming out. Then came the revelation that sent shockwaves through the team. A background check into the property owner of the house where the murders occurred unearthed a name none of them had expected: Richard Ames. a former police captain who had resigned over a decade earlier after a scandal involving planted evidence in a high-profile kidnapping case. Publicly, he disappeared from law enforcement and quietly moved into private security. But records showed he had purchased the house shortly after leaving the force, under a shell company designed to hide his ownership. And, even more unsettling, there were no records of him selling it. Meaning, for all intents and purposes, the crime scene belonged to a disgraced former cop with deep knowledge of how to manipulate investigations. When confronted, Ames denied any connection, insisting he hadn't set foot on the property in years. But his cold eyes and clipped answers told another story. Was he involved? Or was someone using his past to cloud the present? As if that wasn't enough, a retired detective, one who had worked alongside Ames back in the early 2000s, reached out to Lane in private. His voice trembled over the phone as he spoke about a case eerily similar to the current one, filed away in an archive no one had touched in years. A case involving staged bodies, religious symbols, and a suspect who vanished before they could arrest him. The retired officer believed the two cases were connected, possibly even committed by the same hand. He offered to meet in person, but before they could arrange a time, he was found dead in what authorities quickly labeled a suicide. But something about it felt staged. The note he left behind was typed, not handwritten. There were no fingerprints on the scene, not even his own. It was too clean, too convenient, and for Lane, it confirmed her worst fears. Someone was actively covering tracks, and they weren't afraid to kill to keep the past hidden. With pressure mounting and leads growing colder, the case began to take a toll. Internal tensions flared. Some detectives wanted to step back, call it a cold case, and move on. But Lane couldn't. Not when she felt the answer was so close. And not when she discovered something that changed everything, an old photo, found wedged between the pages of a forgotten ledger in Daniel's storage unit. The photo showed a child's birthday party. Balloons.
A cake.
Children smiling for the camera. But there, in the background, mostly out of frame, was a blurry image of someone watching from the trees. Enlarged, the face bore an uncanny resemblance to Caleb Monroe, years younger, but unmistakable. The timestamp on the back. From a town 4 hours away. A town where, coincidentally, another family had been murdered 2 decades earlier in a case that was never solved. Suddenly, this wasn't just about Daniel or Caleb. This was about a pattern, one that stretched back years, maybe longer. But just as Lane began connecting the dots, she received a call that made her blood run cold. The secure server used to archive her personal investigation notes, files she had kept off the department's radar, had been breached. Someone had accessed them remotely, deleted key sections, and left behind one chilling message. It's not your story to tell. Whoever was behind this was watching her every move, staying one step ahead, always in control. And now, Lane was faced with a gut-wrenching question. Was she chasing a killer, or being led into a trap? Because the deeper she looked, the more it seemed like she wasn't uncovering a crime. She was walking straight into one. Lane had faced plenty of dangerous moments in her career. Standoffs, ambushes, the tense silence before breaching a door. But none of that compared to what she felt now, standing in the empty maintenance tunnel beneath the old courthouse, knowing with certainty that this was the final turn in a maze she never volunteered to enter. The faint hum of aging fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as the damp air pressed against her chest, each step echoing too loudly. She followed the signal from the burner phone she traced earlier that day, a trace that led her beneath a city she thought she understood, toward a truth that had been buried for decades. In her backpack was everything: the photo of the children, the case files, Ruth's blood-stained folder, and the memory card she'd found inside Reyes's apartment hidden in a false bottom drawer, holding video evidence that would break everything wide open. But the card wasn't what rattled her, it was the footage itself. Paul, younger, working alongside people she recognized as pillars of the justice system. People still holding power. In the video, they spoke plainly about relocating subjects, covering incidents as accidental fires, and keeping assets like Marissa under psychological suppression to avoid triggering past trauma. It wasn't conspiracy theory anymore. It was conspiracy fact. The final piece had always been hidden in plain sight. The fires. The missing files. The identical reports across state lines. It wasn't just her past they erased. It was a state-sanctioned program, some twisted government initiative from the early 90s that had quietly spiraled into abuse, trauma, and, eventually, mass cover-up. And the man responsible for ensuring no one found out? Deputy Commissioner Charles Greer. A name that had popped up in nearly every unrelated case file she'd reviewed over the past month. A man who had been at every facility that quietly closed. Who signed off on every death certificate that never made it to court. And who, according to the anonymous video feed, now held Paul Reyes hostage. As Lane reached the final door, a rusted steel barrier marked, "Authorized entry only," she paused. Her weapon was steady in her hand, but her mind was chaos. This wasn't just about Paul anymore, or Ruth, or Daniel. This was about everything they took from her, every piece of her life that had been rewritten, reprogrammed, buried under years of false memories. She wasn't just chasing justice. She was reclaiming her own identity. She entered the room with slow, deliberate steps. It was colder than the tunnel, like walking into a crypt. Surveillance monitors lined the wall, and in the center was Paul, restrained, blood drying around his temple. Standing beside him, looking remarkably calm for a man at the center of a violent storm, was Charles Greer. He looked older than his public appearances suggested, but his eyes were sharp and calculated. The man didn't flinch as Lane leveled her gun. "I wondered when you'd get here," he said, voice smooth like a practiced politician. "You've always been the clever one. I warned them about you." Lane didn't speak. She scanned the room, noting 2 armed guards near the back, but she kept her focus on Greer. "Why?" she finally asked, her voice raw. "Why us?" Greer sighed, as if tired of repeating himself to children who didn't understand the weight of power. "Because we needed control. The children we selected showed signs of early resilience, high intelligence, low familial ties. You were all blank slates, ideal for shaping. But some of you," he glanced at Paul, "didn't hold the line." Lane wanted to pull the trigger right then, but she needed more. The world needed more. "So, you let people die? Burned facilities? Buried survivors?" Greer tilted his head. "Collateral. Necessary. We were trying to build something stable. We saved more than we lost." "You broke children," she hissed. "You turned us into weapons." "That's the part you never understood," Greer said, stepping closer. "You were always a weapon. We just helped you aim." In that moment, Lane realized he wasn't going to beg. He believed everything he'd done had been for the greater good. But his expression changed when she dropped the flash drive on the floor and stepped on it. She didn't need to leak it anymore. The live stream had already gone out. Every frame, every voice, every face. She'd sent it to multiple platforms, including a trending YouTube channel known for breaking cold cases wide open. The whole country would know by sunrise. Greer's calm cracked, just slightly. "You think the world will care? We'll spin it. We always do." "Not this time," Lane said. He reached for a weapon she hadn't seen tucked behind the table. The moment he moved, she fired. The bullet hit his shoulder, spinning him back. Paul groaned in the corner, struggling against his restraints. The guards lunged forward, but Lane ducked behind a storage unit, returning fire with precision she barely recognized in herself. One guard dropped. The other hesitated just long enough for her to flank him and knock him unconscious with the butt of her weapon. She turned back to Greer, now on the ground, blood blooming across his coat. "You'll be hunted for this," he spat. Lane stepped over him, pulled out her phone, and hit send on her final message to the press. "They're already watching." She freed Paul, who coughed and looked at her like he'd just seen a ghost. "You shouldn't have come." "I had to," she said quietly. "You were the only person who ever looked out for me, even if you were lying." He tried to smile, then winced. Not all of it was a lie. They limped out of the tunnel together, sirens already approaching in the distance. Lane looked up at the sky, a flash of dawn breaking across the city. For a moment, she felt something like relief, like peace. But as they reached the street, A black SUV idled across the road. A figure stepped out. A woman in a gray suit, face expressionless. She handed Lane a manila envelope without a word, then disappeared back into the car. The SUV drove off, tires whispering against wet pavement. Lane opened it. Inside was a photo. Her. As a child. But this time, she wasn't in front of the state facility. She was standing beside her real parents. And they were very much alive. The days that followed were a strange mixture of chaos and quiet reckoning. News outlets across the country ran with the story under headlines like Government Child Experiment Scandal Exposed and Burned Files, Buried Truths, the secret behind closed doors. Investigative podcasts, YouTube creators covering trending mysteries, and former insiders all jumped on the wave of revelations that Lane had unleashed. The footage she released was undeniable, the documents impossible to refute, and as more survivors came forward, voices once silenced by fear and manipulation, a portrait of unimaginable abuse and control began to take form in the public eye. Congressional hearings were announced, former officials were summoned, and the justice system, for once, looked itself in the mirror with something like shame. Yet through it all, Lane found herself sitting at the edge of a cliffside cemetery outside the city, staring at the simple headstone of a woman whose life was ended to keep the secrets buried. Ruth Carter's name had been restored in the National Registry. Her story was no longer a footnote. It was the spark that burned the whole house down. Lane didn't speak much to the reporters or the public. She let the facts speak for themselves. She wasn't a savior. She was a survivor who had finally pulled the thorn from her own skin. Still, a part of her wrestled with the overwhelming scale of what had been uncovered. How many lives had been erased? How many names had never even made it to a folder or photo? There were no complete lists, no definitive answers. Just the chilling certainty that the truth had been manufactured and weaponized long before she ever knew she was part of it. Paul was recovering in a secure facility under a new identity, both for his protection and because the system that once turned him into a tool would surely do it again, if given the chance. He and Lane spoke briefly one final time. It wasn't a tearful goodbye or some tidy wrap-up of emotions. They both had seen too much for that. But in his eyes, she saw something that hadn't been there before: peace. Or at least, the beginning of it. He handed her a single photo before he left. It was the original copy of the image that had started her descent down this path. But now, the edges were marked with new handwriting. On the back, it said, "You were never meant to be forgotten." Lane kept the envelope with a photo of her real parents close, but she didn't immediately search for them. Not out of fear, but because she needed time. Time to breathe. To figure out who she was now that she wasn't living under someone else's version of her life. She knew from the medical files recovered that they hadn't abandoned her, that they had been told she died during birth complications. The records were forged, just like everything else. But reuniting with them wasn't just about closure. It was about healing without dragging the past into a space that could still be sacred. If she chose to knock on that door one day, it would be when she was ready to be more than just a ghost returning home. The system didn't crumble overnight, but it shook. And that mattered. Arrests were made, resignations swept through bureaucracies like wildfire, and new legislation began surfacing with real teeth for accountability. The trending topic across YouTube, Reddit, and major news outlets became truth leaks, a wave of whistleblowers emboldened by what Lane exposed. And though not every conspiracy proved real, the culture had shifted. People weren't so quick to dismiss survivors anymore. Not when their stories were written in scars and silence. As for Lane, she didn't return to the force. She declined every offer for book deals, media exclusives, and interviews on primetime talk shows. Instead, she moved into a small coastal town where no one recognized her name. She spent mornings walking along the shore and evenings writing down everything, not for an audience, but for herself. She'd kept too much locked away for too long. And now she wrote it all. Every detail, every face, every feeling she'd once forced herself to forget. Because this time, no one was going to rewrite her story but her. And yet, on one quiet afternoon as she sipped coffee on her porch, she received a plain envelope in the mail. No return address. No postmark. Inside was a single USB drive and a short note. You uncovered one chapter. But the program was bigger. You were one of many. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned the drive in her fingers, the ocean breeze tugging at the edges of the paper. It didn't feel like a threat, more like a warning. Or maybe an invitation. She looked out over the crashing waves, her breath steady, her heart no longer racing.
She had a choice now.
Walk away. Or open another door. The story may have ended for now, but something deeper still pulsed beneath the surface. A secret with more layers. More names. More shadows. And Lane knew, even in that moment of stillness, that the search for the truth wasn't over. It never really is.